Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the Gospel of Mark. This is session 4. The title is Satisfied. The text is Mark chapter 6, verse 30 through 44. And the lesson summary sentence is Jesus satisfies by providing for our needs. I'm using a story that's known in my area about a very wealthy man, a billionaire. His name was Aubrey McClendon. He was the founder of Chesapeake, and he was a philanthropist, an entrepreneur. He was instrumental and owns 20% of the professional basketball team that's here in Oklahoma. And he died several years back. The police ruled it a suicide, but the medical examiner ruled it as an accident. And so I'm going to tell something about that, give some information. The people here will know who I'm talking about, but you might want to use someone else. There's just all kinds of popular people in our culture. Marilyn Monroe was a movie actress, and she had beauty and fame and money, and yet life wasn't worth living for her. Robin Williams was an amazingly talented actor and funny man, and yet life wasn't worth living for him. There's Ernest Hemingway, the writer, and so you can just go down the list of different people who were not satisfied and thought that the solution was to end their life. And of course, that's not the solution. The transition sentence says, in today's session, we're going to look at how Jesus is the only one who can truly satisfy our needs. A little boy was asked, what's your favorite Bible story? He said, I like the one about the crowd that loafs and fishes. Well, I'm not sure he got the story correct, but we hope to correct that this morning. In this text, just a little bit of background. You'll remember that the movement of Mark is presenting popularity and then hostility. And you'll see that when it comes to this passage as well. In Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, Jesus is in his hometown. The people are offended by him when he preaches in the synagogue, and it says he can do very few miracles because of their lack of faith. So even his hometown people were hostile towards him. Then it goes to him sending out the disciples, and they come back with great stories of success and people being healed and people repentant and demons exorcised out of people. And so there is a story of popularity. Then we go to chapter 6, verse 14 to 29, and it's this parentheses. It tells us about the death of John the Baptist. Now, according to where it's placed in Mark's gospel, John has already died, but the purpose of John putting the story of John Mark in here is to partly explain why they've moved out of this area that was under the control of Herod Antipas, who is the one who took John's life, but also it foreshadows the death of an innocent one, the Lord Jesus Christ. And then we come back to the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and that's immediately followed by Jesus walking on water, and both of those show the popularity, the power of Jesus Christ. And then you come to chapter 7, and there's this rising opposition towards Jesus from the Pharisees, and Jesus uses the Old Testament to expose their hypocrisy. So there's this continuing movement of popularity and hostility. And what you see in this story is Jesus takes a hopeless situation and he turns it into an occasion for victory. And he did this by using those and working through the life of those who served him. So just imagine this scene as we open up the text in Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 32. And the first title is the title Rest. And what I intend to do is just read through the passage and give some explanation, try to help people see what's taking place here, and then we'll move into some application. Verse 30, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. And you'll notice that it's not talking about what they preached, but it's what they had done. And they are extensions of the ministry of Jesus Christ. And because of that, they are accomplishing the works of God. So it's highlighting the work of Jesus and his ministry through these apostles. In verse 31, he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while." For many people were coming and going, and they didn't even have time to eat. So they went away in the boat by themselves to a remote place. Now, we're not told where this remote place is, but when you read the comparison in Luke chapter 9, Luke tells us it was in Bethsaida. And from where he was in Capernaum, near the top of the Sea of Galilee, it was about a 4-mile by boat to the place where they're going. That's what scholars estimate. And if you take it by land, it's about 8 miles. And so what's happening, we'll see, is the disciples are going by boat. They no doubt are facing a headwind because it's taking them longer to get there. But the people are going by foot, and they're there to meet the disciples when they arrive. We'll see that in the next passage. Now, notice this involves spending time with Jesus and then being with others who are with Jesus. So the disciples are not only going to be spending time with Jesus, they're going to be spending time with each other. So there's a rhythm of rest that is found here. In fact, you find this rhythm in all of life. There is ministering, and then there's retreating. There's day, and there's night. Even your heartbeat has a rhythm of beating and then resting, and beating, then resting. When it comes to breathing, there's breathing in, and then there's breathing out. And so there's this rhythm. And so I'm going to ask the class, what is a good rhythm for you when it comes to your week, when it comes to your day? Just to get some kind of conversation talking about rest. Now, Exodus 20 talks about the Sabbath and rest. And Exodus 20 ties the Sabbath to creation when it says to remember the Sabbath. And so it's built into God's creation. It's built into God's design that human beings are to have a time of activity and then a time of rest. And this activity is built into the rhythm of life so that we could remember to celebrate God. That's the purpose of taking a day off. That's the purpose of resting according to Exodus 20. The emphasis is upon the worship and the celebration of God. But in Deuteronomy chapter 5, we have another listing of the 10 Commandments, and it mentions remembering the Sabbath, but there it doesn't tie the Sabbath to creation. It ties the Sabbath to redemption. And God had delivered these Israelites from this inhumane cycle. They were simply cogs in the system of work that the Egyptians had when they were building the cities and building their pyramids. And it's a way of reminding the people that you're not just a cog in an economic system, that there's something significant about you, and it is a time for you to rest. If all you do is work, then you're no better than a slave. And so the Exodus 20 is to teach us that there's a rhythm to life. And this rhythm is built in for us to celebrate God. And Deuteronomy 5 tells us that there is a time in which we rejoice in the redemption of God, in which He affirms our humanity, and which we thank Him for His salvation. But none of these are done in isolation. Notice what happens with the disciples. They're not just with Jesus, they're also with one another. And so my question to the class is, what happens when you are with others that you love and they are people who love Jesus? What's supposed to happen when we share community with one another? And what I'm wanting to bring out of the class is part of God's rest for us is not just simply physical rest or spiritual rest where we're in isolation with God, we're alone with God. That's valuable, that has its place, and it's necessary. But part of what God does in restoring us is He puts us in the company of people we love, and people who love us, and people who love God. It may be like last night with my family when we had a dinner meal together and we laughed and we told stories and we caught up with one another. And so there's times of encouragement, there's times of support, there's times of sympathy. It's to be a time of refreshment, a time of joy. So there's something about being with people. God intends us to have people in which we spend time with. There's so much to do for Jesus. The community that I live in is 125,000 people. And if we take the typical percentage that they say actually attends church on Sunday, which would be 18%, out of 125,000 people, on any given Sunday, maybe 22,000 people would be in all the churches of my community. Over 100,000 people in my community on any given Sunday are not at church. There is so much to do. Why would we ever rest? Because we need to rest in order to spend time with Christ, to be refreshed. And when we spend time with Christ and we spend time with Christ's people, God works through that to help us have an impact upon our ministry. So Jesus satisfies us. And one of the ways he does that is providing for our need to rest. Rest physically and emotionally and spiritually and in other ways. The second point is response. Jesus satisfies by providing for our needs. And again, I want to read the text and explain it and enlarge on it, help the people to see the big picture of this text. Verse 33, but many saw them leaving and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. The picture apparently is there's a group that starts out, they see where the disciples are headed, they have a good idea of it, and as they're going along, they tell others, and no doubt some of the people they tell stop what they're doing and they join in the crowd. And as the crowd is moving along the shore to the location that Jesus is going to, it swells as more and more people join in on the crowd. And verse 34, when we went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. One of the fascinating things for me is the difference, the way people see the same situation. A mother was taking her son to school one morning, and he called out from the back seat, "Mother, where are all the idiots?" And she said, "Son, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, yesterday when Dad was taking me to school, he was saying this person was an idiot and that person was an idiot." Well, isn't it interesting? There may not have been anything different in the traffic on the way to school, but the two people saw things different. And when Jesus saw the crowd, now the disciples are just exhausted. The reason Jesus is taking them away to a place that is isolated is so that they can physically rest and they can be spiritually rejuvenated. And you can just imagine when the disciples saw the crowd, it doesn't say this, but they may have very well felt, "Oh no, I've got nothing left to give." But notice what it says about Jesus. It says Jesus had compassion. This word is only used with Jesus, or it's used of a character that Jesus tells about that represents him. Only this word. It's our word compassion is made from two Latin compounds that mean with passion or feeling the point of suffering. The Greek word that's used here refers to the guts, and the Jews believed that instead of feeling from our heart, that when we had strong emotions, we felt them in our abdomen. And I'm sure that you may have had some experience where you felt so strongly, you were so grieved, or maybe you were so happy that you just didn't feel a need to eat because you had such strong emotions going on. And so the Jews recognized that, and they used a word to describe deep emotion. Now it translated a Hebrew word that was translated compassion, and the Hebrew word was a reference to a mother's womb. And so they described a word that showed how much a mother loved the baby that was just below her heart. So it's a very powerful word that is used here. And Mark goes on to explain that the reason why Jesus felt such compassion, such love, such pity, such empathy, such sympathy with the people is because he saw them as shepherds or sheep without a shepherd. Now there's a lot of references to that picture in the Old Testament, and you may want to have your class look up some of these verses. One would be Numbers 27 verse 17, another's Ezekiel 34 verses 1 to 6, and Ezekiel 34 verse 23. But let me just give you an example of the passage in Numbers 27. Moses is praying to God, and he's asking God for the leader that's going to come after him, that's going to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. And what he asked for is that the people, after he's gone, would not be sheep without a shepherd. And the one he's praying for, interestingly enough, is a man named Joshua. And the name Joshua in the Greek form is Jesus. Isn't it interesting? Moses is in a sense praying for Jesus to lead the people of God after he's gone. And so it's this powerful picture of conveying that Jesus is this expected and promised Messiah and shepherd that we have been anticipating. Now notice, he sees the people as being shepherdless. We refer to people who are without salvation, or maybe they're without a church, they're not active in church. We refer to them as unchurched or lost. But let's just talk for a moment. What would it look like? What would come to mind if we looked at people as though they were unshepherded? And I've gotten some pictures out of magazines of various people, and I'm just going to show those pictures of the various people that I got. And I say, what do you suppose it looks like in this man's life to not have a shepherd? And then what does it look like in this group's life? It was a couple and a single woman. What does it look like for these people to be unshepherded? And what I'm saying is Jesus saw something in them that touched and moved his heart in a way that even though he's exhausted, he and his disciples pour into these lives. And then it says, the last part of verse 34, then he began to teach them many things. It's written in a tense that meant he continued teaching. He just continued from that point of the day forward into just pouring out. Isn't it interesting that when he saw them as sheep without a shepherd, the real desire of his heart was to introduce them to the teachings of God that would refresh their soul, that would strengthen them in their weaknesses, that would give them a hope in their hopelessness. And where did he find that? He found that in teaching them the Word of God. One of the things that people need to be taught is the gospel. And this would be a good time just to talk to people and go through clearly what's the gospel. Maybe you could have a gospel track, and everyone could have a gospel track, and you could just walk through that gospel track. Or you could take the inside cover of your teacher's quarterly, which is also in their personal study guide, and just walk through and say, no doubt Jesus talked about these things, God's love for them, and the fact that they're sinners, and there's forgiveness that's available, and it's found in a Savior who is Jesus. But one of the things that my community needs, and your communities, the most desperate thing, is the gospel. And any time that you can take a moment and help clarify to your class the gospel, to make it simple and understandable so that it is explainable, you're always doing people a good benefit. So there is the response. And then third, there is resources. Verses 35 to 38. It says in verse 35, when it grew late, his disciples approached him and said, This place is deserted, and it is already late. Send them away so that they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat. Now, it's interesting. They assumed the role of an advisor instead of disciples of Jesus. I mean, do you suppose Jesus wasn't aware of the hour? Do you suppose Jesus wasn't aware that these people could be hungry? I mean, it's amazing to me how they think they need to remind Jesus, they need to advise Jesus. And I mean, when it was time to stop teaching, he knew when to stop teaching. When it was time for them to do something for the people to meet their needs, he knew how to do that. But they seem to have to coach Jesus on these things. And so, of course, Jesus does the unexpected, as he always does, which seems to be a contradictory statement. But notice what he does in verse 37. You give them something to eat. And the emphasis in the original language is on the word you. You and you alone. You figure out how to do this. And they said to him, should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? That's 8 months' salary. Now, I have bought some meals for my family, and I have a large family, and that's a lot of money, but 8 months' salary? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. In doing this, he uses them to provide these resources. And of course, they come back, and it's John that tells us in chapter 9, when he tells this story, that they found this loaves and fish from a boy. And of course, you can take time to explain about the fish and the loaves and how poor they were in terms of smallness and that kind of thing. The loaves were probably made of barley, which is what the poor people would do. And so the disciples go and check out their resources, and it's 5 loaves and 2 fish, but it's also the disciples. And also, it's the Lord. That's their resource as well. We are surrounded by need. And what can we possibly do when we have so little? Well, you're standing in front of Niagara Falls looking for a drink of water, when you're standing in the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ. So they go and they find their resources, and they report it back to Jesus. And then the last is there is relief. Chapter 6, verse 39 to 44. Then he instructed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, many commentators make much of this phrase, green grass, because one of the famous shepherd passages is Psalm 23, and it talks about he leads us to green pastures. And it's also this picture of instructing them to sit down in groups of 10s or groups of 50s and groups of 100s is a reflection back, many scholars believe, to Moses when he organized the tribes and how they would camp. And so here's the new Moses, here's the new Messiah that we've been expecting. In verse 41, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves. This was a typical practice of a father at a family gathering. And he would take the bread, and typically he would bow his head in humility as opposed to looking up. But Jesus is the Son of God, so he looks at his Father, and then he breaks the bread. And the picture is he breaks this, and then he hands it to the disciples, and he just breaks bread and keeps handing it to the disciple, breaks bread, and he does the same with the fish. And then they go out and deliver it, and then they come back to him because they've run out of resources, and Jesus continues to break bread and hand fish to them. And so there's this pattern of the disciples going back and forth to the crowd and coming back to Jesus to get what the crowd needs in order to meet their needs. It's a beautiful picture. And then verse 42, everyone ate and was satisfied. Now what's unusual about that is the people would usually eat until the food was gone. But that doesn't mean that they were satisfied. There were rare occasions when there would be enough food that the people could eat until they could not eat any longer. And that's what's being pictured here. They eat until they say, I don't want any more. And then they picked up 12 baskets full of pieces of bread and fish. And there's debate over what is the size of these baskets. And there seems to be two things that are suggested. There was a small basket that they would carry, kind of like a lunch pail, and they would carry their lunch in it and other kinds of items that might be in that basket, a little wicker basket. And then there was the bigger one that was like a big tray. And the possibility, if it was that, is they got that out of the boat because they had big wicker trays in which they would use to move the fish around and scoop the fish out of the boat. And so we don't know which one it is, but whichever it was, the disciples had a basket apiece with this. And then verse 44, now those who had eaten the loaves were 5,000 men. And of course, the smallest estimate I've heard of this crowd is it could be 12,000, and it easily could have been 15,000 when you include women and children into this. But the whole picture is the picture of the Messiah, the new Moses that's coming to bring the people to redemption. There's something called the Golden Triangle. In Australia, for 15 years, twice a year, they did a survey of 60,000 people, and it was a research on satisfaction. And after 15 years, doing it twice, amongst 60,000 people, they came to the conclusion that there were three things that contributed to people's satisfaction. The one is relationships. The second was they had meaningful work to do. They did something that made them feel like they were doing something significant. And the third was security. So after 15 years, 60,000 people, here are the three things they discovered that people said, this is what makes me feel satisfied. Relationships, meaningful work, and security. Now, in the security, the way that was expressed by the people was money. They had enough money to satisfy their needs, meet their needs, but what they really were driving at was security. Now, think about this. If satisfaction, a human being experienced satisfaction in these three areas, think about this in terms of Jesus. Because the lesson summary statement says, Jesus satisfies by providing for our needs. So what about relationships? Can someone in the class quote for us the Great Commandment? The Great Commandment, talks about we love God and we love people. Isn't it interesting? The greatest commandment that summarizes all of the Old Testament is about relationships. A relationship with God and a relationship with people. That takes us to Jesus. Jesus will help us to love God and help us to love people. Jesus satisfies by providing our need for relationships. What about meaning? Can anyone quote the Great Commission? There, Jesus said that we have this wonderful responsibility of making disciples for Jesus Christ. We would spend our Christian life helping others come to know Him, to grow in Him. And what Jesus says, He writes an entirely new history for a person and for their family. So what could be more meaningful than touching people's lives for eternity? And do you remember what the last part of the Great Commission says? And lo, I am with you to the end of the age. And that is security that is expressed in the Great Commission. And those three, relationships and meaning and security, are found all throughout the Scriptures when it talks about our relationship with Jesus. Jesus satisfies us by meeting the basic needs of our life when it comes to meaningful living, when it comes to security. And I'm sure you can make some hay out of that. Now, the way I'm going to close the lesson is hand each member an index card. On one side of the card, I want them to write the lesson summary statement. Jesus satisfies by providing for our needs. And then on the other side, I want them to write the words relationships, meaning, and security. Relationships, meaning, and security. And then I'm going to ask them, would you pick one of those? And this week, what you'll pray about and what you'll seek to notice is how either you can build a relationship with a person or build your relationship with Christ, or maybe you can get involved in some kind of work that is meaningful and touches people's lives, or you can find a way to affirm security, or you can gain security through the work of Jesus in your life. That might be as simple as coming to a financial plan on how you're going to pay off debt. But what I'm leading them to do is see Jesus is the one that satisfies. The world tells us that by the dissatisfaction. And how does he do that? So oftentimes it's through relationships and meaningful work and security. What a wonderful lesson you have to teach. God bless you.